Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for your participation this afternoon. Webinar, Stress Less Spaces, Rethinking Schoolyards for Student Wellbeing, presented by Dr. Gweneth Leigh. Before we commence today's presentation, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra and Canberra region as the traditional custodians of the land where the Learning Environment ACT chapter is based, and we extend this acknowledgement to all First Nations people and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Landscape architect and public health academic, as Eric mentioned, based at the Health Research Institute at the University of Canberra. And I'm here to talk to you today about the impact of our built environment on the health and habits of our younger population, and at a place where they spend heaps of time within our schoolyards. Now, the overview for my talk today is to really start a conversation about people in place. I'd like to highlight some of the key contextual factors around schoolyard design, the relationship between people in place to a site, and really build the evidence to help drive change with schoolyards and schoolyard design. So in starting this conversation, I do want to share that I'm a strong believer of beauty. I think being in beautiful spaces evokes an emotional response in us. I think it might make us feel safe. It allows us to feel connection and meaning to a place and to each other. And in fact, there is this German term that captures this feeling of connection to place called Umwelt, that refers to how we perceive, experience, and interpret the world through our senses. And despite sharing the same environment, our Umwelt is different and unique to us and shaped by our unique life experiences. For me, beauty starts in the garden. Prior to becoming a landscape architect, I worked in public horticulture. This included arboretums and public gardens in Boston, DC, and Colorado. This picture is actually of me at the National Arboretum in DC, where I managed 13 acres adjacent to the Anacostia River. My coworkers there included black rat snakes and snapping turtles. And it was really maintaining these public spaces that opened my eyes to how people engaged with green space, what they liked and what they didn't. And this included noticing where people paused, where they passed through, and those areas that they avoided. Now, as a landscape architect, it was exposure to less beautiful spaces that really broadened my interest in health. One project was the Grand Canal in Mexico City, which was this enormous open sewer that pumped all the waste of 20 million people out to agricultural land. And it was also where you had a lot of communities living next to this enormous drainage pipe. The stench and the unpleasantness of this environment flagged some important questions to me, notably, how do we design and sustain built environments to foster health and healing? How can design interventions help address inequities and inequalities? And how do we define and measure healthy environments? What metrics do we use to determine if they're successful? At a time when chronic issues like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity continue to rise, I really wanted to better understand how we could better build our outdoor spaces to build and support healthy habits. So years ago, I explored the idea of what a healthy space looked like through an exhibition called Bloom, which showcased projects volunteered by designers and users alike across Australia of healthy and unhealthy landscapes. Now, it was while I was raising a young family that then also drew my attention to the differences in how the young, the old, the healthy, and the unwell really experienced and interpreted our everyday outdoor environments. And it was when I grew to question why some spaces seem to be valued less than others. In particular, there was a strong disparity I found in schoolyards, particularly between the care and attention that was being given to some of the indoor spaces of school environments, but often less attention to the outdoor environments, particularly in high school. So the last few years I've spent doing a PhD trying to identify how to better build their value, their beauty from a health perspective. I wanted to understand what was the umwelt of the students who used these spaces. How do the sensory experiences of these environments shape our desire to be in them and to engage with them? So to start this question, it was really about understanding the context of these spaces and their stories. Now, for example, for those of you who are based in Canberra, many of you would be familiar with the bogong moth. Now, bear with me here. Right now, we're in this transition period from spring to summer, And the bogong moth makes this great migration, traveling about 1,000 kilometers from the hot, arid plains of southern Queensland to the cool, snowy caves of the Snowy Mountains, where they undergo a dormancy similar to hibernation before flying back to their birthplace in cooler months. Now, in Ngunnawal culture, this bogong moth migration was really central to their traditional way of life. They would gather in the mountains to feast on the moths in an annual event marked as a significant social and cultural gathering. And the significance of this migration is often marked within Canberra's landscape. You can see it in sculptures along the roadway. The one to the left is on the way to Tuggeranong. You can see it in front of national institutions like the National Museum, which is the one in the top right. You can even find it in the backdrop of skate parks, which is the image on the bottom right. These stories are important because it's stories like the bogong moth that really bring the stories of a city's landscape to life. It's how we connect to a place, gain a sense of agency and ownership over its stories. Yet rarely do I find these narratives embedded into a place where I think they could really resonate the most, our schoolyards. When the world grew quiet in 2020 with COVID-19, I would actually visit the empty schoolyards of surrounding high schools. I was curious about what stories I would find. And the landscape narratives I saw really resonated closely to the landscapes I experienced growing up. And while buildings of educational facilities, they've really evolved over the past 30 years, I would argue that the schoolyard has really struggled to keep up. The pace of change in these spaces is slow. As well, many of you probably already know, in secondary years, the schoolyard, it can be mostly pavement, it's grass, it's hot. There might be seating areas, there might be shade. I have a colleague who likes to refer to shade as trying to dress it like a bathing suit. Rarely do we get full coverage. Usually what we get is bikini style. But these are some of the spaces which I visited during this quiet period. And in landscape architecture, there is a saying that while good architecture makes cities alluring, it's their open spaces that make them livable. And I guess I just have to question, are we making livable spaces within our schoolyard environments? There was one Canberra case study that I looked at as part of a design studio. And within this schoolyard, it had a central courtyard that was essentially a concrete jungle. It was literally 54,000 square feet of mostly impermeable surface. The water runoff generated by this concrete jungle actually had a deleterious effect on where it went off-site. There were nearly 400 trees on site, but most of them were located around the periphery. Not a lot of them were present to actually provide shade across some of these paved spaces. Most dramatically, they had a synthetic sporting oval, and it was very hot. I guess the principal told me that on warmer days, students actually couldn't use it because the heat would actually melt the soles of their shoes. And issues around heat in our play spaces, it actually continues to permeate globally. This was an article, a headline of an article I saw while I was overseas in the US, where schools there too are actually ripping up playgrounds because of the heat generation on the warmer months, and in the initiative to really put in more cooling areas, such as through shade and plantings. Now, as we all know, most schools have an occupant density that are much higher than the average workplace, comparable to that of prisons or in commercial airlines. And as such, the way in which schools and their surroundings are designed really do have a big impact on the learning, health, and safety of its occupants. Now, fortunately, over the years, there's this growing body of research that demonstrates that nature is good for you. We know that it reduces harm, for instance, by filtering the air and stormwater. We know that it has restorative impacts in terms of reducing stress, frustration, and anger. And we know that it also builds capacity. It creates those spaces where we can engage in physical activity and catch up with friends. Now, the notion of these positive health impacts of outdoor spaces isn't actually anything new. At the turn of the 20th century, cities really struggled with water and airborne diseases like cholera and tuberculosis. And with limited medicine to treat emergent infections, cities around the world turned to urban design and open space as tools for disease management. Pictured on the left here is Frederick Law Olmsted, who we know as father of landscape architecture, and he created Central Park, that image in the middle, to actually become the lungs of a city. It was really the place where people of all backgrounds could benefit from its use. It's worth noting his first son actually died of cholera. Now, closer to home on the right, you've got Joseph Maiden, who responded at a time of rising death rates within overcrowded Sydney suburbs, really spurred and campaigned for more equitable distribution of recreation space within Sydney. Now, of course, when COVID swept across the world in 2020, these benefits of outdoor space really became apparent. Our streets, our parks, and our open spaces were the pressure valve to relieve the physical and mental stresses of social isolation. And the pandemic really was a reminder of the essential service that's provided by open space. Now, in a combat to fight urban sprawl, we're densifying our cities, which is a great thing, but it also comes at the price of developing our green spaces. I was looking at one paper that did a meta-analysis of 15 years of research into the impacts of urban infill, and it found that neighborhood green space not only decreased, but it was also of low quality and perceived as a low priority by residents. And headlines from recent years reflect some of these challenges, particularly from the development side. New terminology has actually been created to explain the phenomenon of this disconnect with our outdoor spaces, terms like extinction of experience and plant blindness. Now, as accessibility to open spaces diminish, schoolyards really grow in importance as spaces where students can be exposed to nature. This time outdoors has been shown to have positive impacts on students' health. Outdoor activity helps teenagers by encouraging risk-taking, developing resilience, and improving their social skills. Studies have shown how greening school grounds enhances social inclusion within social communities, and it improves student activity levels, interpersonal skills, and classroom behaviors. Even the view of green space from classroom windows has been correlated with positive impacts on student attention span, productivity, and stress levels. Yet rarely are high school outdoor spaces designed as a tool to improve the well-being of students. And I think this is a missed opportunity because our students do need help. As we all know, students are a vulnerable population. Many don't get a choice in terms of where they go to school. Australian students spend close to 11,000 hours of their adolescence at school, well above the OECD average of 7,500 hours. And as we all know, mental health issues are on the rise, especially around stress, anxiety, and depression, and at a global rate. We see US trends on the left here in terms of depression and rates by age, with those in 16 to 19 years of age at the top of that cohort. And then on the right, you've got Australian trends, which again is showing the decline in mental health and well-being, particularly for that age group between 15 to 24-year-olds. We've also got issues around the societal context. The schoolyard is the backdrop to many concerning trends. You've got issues around device usage, concerns around climate change, unhealthy habits like vaping. All of these are live issues within schoolyard environments. And while there's global recognition on the importance of healthy schools, the contribution of schoolyards in these discussions is vastly understudied. So how did we get here? Well, there's a few challenges that we've identified. One is that schoolyard indicators don't necessarily account for user experiences. We've got a series of benchmarks that often look at the aesthetics and the beauty of these spaces. We've got awards that document their efficiencies in terms of sustainability efforts, but we don't actually have a lot of knowledge in terms of the perceptions of these spaces and their use by the students and the staff who use them. There's few examples documenting what secondary schoolyard design is as a tool for mental health. And there's little knowledge known about those adolescent perceptions of outdoor spaces. Now, what I think brings these different narratives together is this growing field of restorative landscape research. And in this picture here, we feature Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, who had this phenomenal book written based on their research called The Experience of Nature, where essentially they identify that humans prefer those settings in which they're likely to function most effectively. And their research was really underpinned by two theories. One is called attention restoration theory, which asserts that people can concentrate better after spending time or looking at scenes of nature, where restorative landscapes are categorized under themes of fascination, being away, extent, and compatibility. The second theory is stress reduction theory, And this one asserts that natural environments can help facilitate recovery from stress through reduced psychological and physiological arousal through positive effects. So those biological factors of being in outdoor spaces. Now, some of the tools for measuring some of these impacts are collected through methods like questionnaires, interviews, surveys, and self-report. All of this framework provides designers like yourselves and myself with tools for assessing the qualities of the environments we create, and really builds on our knowledge of how users perceive these places that we design, and really help build our body of evidence based on this design knowledge. So my research has really focused on this idea of restoration as places that enable an individual to rebuild their capabilities in ways that help them meet the demands of everyday life. And it was really shifting from looking at human and landscape properties in separate silos to instead more of a holistic approach, looking at human landscape interactions to better understand how particular environments are perceived, what they mean to people, and how they contribute towards a sense of well-being. Now, as part of my work, I explored this by investigating how schoolyards were valued by the designers, the administrators, and the users of these spaces. And I did this through 3 terms, what I called understanding fitness, whether the opportunities provided by these outdoor spaces were perceived to meet the needs of student users. We looked at it in terms of freedom. How does the physical environment maximize opportunities presented in these spaces? And finally, how does it meet need? How should a place best meet user requirements? And I did these through a series of studies, which I'll go through with you. The first one being fit. So in Schoolyard Fit was a study that I undertook, which interviewed principals and designers from across Australia. There are approximately almost 40 that we conducted during COVID, predominantly through phone interviews and through surveys. And during the phone interviews, we were asking questions such as, what is the role of school grounds? What differentiates these spaces from the classroom? What are the outdoor needs of secondary students? What features make a schoolyard safe? And how do you measure the success of a schoolyard design? Now, to understand the perceived adequacy of existing schoolyards and meeting student well-being needs, the phone interviews, I first asked whether schoolyards were fit for purpose. And shockingly, over half of all the participants actually responded no. Said 1, compared to the classroom, the design of secondary schoolyards were perceived as undervalued, neglected, and consistently treated as residual space. One principal shared that while there's a strong desire to have kids to be outside and learn and have areas and spaces to do that, our programming doesn't seem to value it. A lack of resourcing seems to affect what schools can maintain. So when I asked them and had them rank, what are the biggest barriers opposing what you can do in these environments? The top one at the tippy top of the list was inadequacy of funding. And obviously this has flow-on effects in terms of what they can resource, what they can maintain. And if you have low resources and low maintenance, it does tend to create spaces that are perceived as low value. As one principal remarked to me, if it's not well kept, then the kids will destroy it and they won't value it. Poor schoolyard outcomes were also viewed by some practitioners as a product of poorly conceived design briefs. Said one practice, compared to the specificity of school buildings and classrooms, proposals for school grounds are often lacking in detail and quite bland and fairly perfunctory, like it's just a checklist of things to include. Another landscape architect shocked me by saying the actual brief for the external areas hasn't changed a great deal in the 35 years I've been working on them. Another challenge that was acknowledged in discussions with principals and designers was that you also have a couple different standards. On the one hand, you've got one set of design standards, which are often more regulatory in nature in terms of looking after the health and safety of the student. And then you have another sense of standards in terms of student well-being design frameworks. And that was kind of looking at the affordances of actually seeing how the physical environment can really support the student and their well-being. But these two frameworks often sit within independent silos. When I asked designers what schoolyard benefits were most supported by existing government design standards, we found that same trend. It was issues of low maintenance, physical safety, and affordable upkeep. And those that were less supported at the bottom of the list tend to be those things, again, that contribute towards well-being. It was about creating places of refuge, design innovation, biophilia. When I asked about schoolyard fit, so this is actually taking that student well-being framework and again asking first of the designers and principals, what is the appropriateness of this list in the schoolyard? Are they actionable ideas in terms of issues of inclusion, student voice, partnerships, and leadership? Is the schoolyard an appropriate place for some of those ideas? And the overwhelming feeling was yes. And that's illustrated in the graph here, which are these solid bars. Overwhelmingly yes by designers and practitioners saying these were relevant to schoolyard design issues. But then when we asked, are these in practice being delivered within schoolyard designs? The response was more mediocre. Probably about 30 to 40% of participants thought that we were. Now, it also is about understanding the need of schoolyard. Are we meeting the behaviors that should be most beneficial within these schoolyard environments? And so I asked designers and principals, what is the role of student voice? And again, principals and designers were enthusiastic in saying there is a need for the student voice to be reflected in the designs that we create within the schoolyards. A lot of principals were saying that is their space. The classroom is the structure where the adults they conduct their lessons, but their authority is outdoors. Yet when we ask how often do designers have a chance to actually incorporate students within the design of these spaces, only 14% said that they actually engage with students on a regular basis. From the conversations I had with principals and designers, we also tried to identify what makes the perfect schoolyard space. What are those traits that are most important to incorporate to create spaces for well-being for students? And when we analyzed the feedback we were given, it really fell into 4 categories. One was around issues of agency. So those areas that foster connectedness and empowers users to create their own opportunities. It was about talking about engagement, supporting a student's capacity to socialize in ways that were compatible with the school community. It was about issues of passage, providing a frame of reference to users on the physical and conceptual framework and organization of the schoolyard space. And it was about attraction, those elements that enable students to relax, interact with others, and really create positive schoolyard associations. And what was interesting is when you start pulling back and seeing some of the differences and the alignments between the designers and principals, there was a lot in alignment in terms of agency and engagement, in terms of those traits that were ranked quite highly and in sync. And where things started to fall apart a bit was actually when you get to attraction, which I think reflects what I talked about earlier, that sense of Umwelt, in that we each have our own idea of beauty and attraction and what that means to us. And I think is a reflection of the importance then of having many voices at the table when we're creating the spaces and the types of needs that need to be addressed when they're being used. So for instance, this was some of those scales. When I looked at issues of agency, seeing what we had in common between designers and principals, it was the creation of a cultural heart was top and foremost. Areas that encouraged risk, a welcoming frontage, high quality materials, connection to country. Areas where we had slight differences between designers and principals. Designers were a bit more fluid in terms of prioritizing student-directed spaces, giving them that agency to have more opportunity to dictate the terms in which they engage with these spaces. On the other side, you had principals who recognized the need to have safe spaces for specific year levels and really had the desire to, make visible sustainable design initiatives, make those learning opportunities in the schoolyards the students could benefit from. When we looked at the topic of engagement, again, the high priority were creation of communal spaces at a variety of different levels. It was also making sure that students had a choice in terms of where and how they socialize. And that really reflects the need for the diversity of environments. It was the desire for outdoor learning connections and natural settings. And again, you had some different priorities between designers and principals. Designers really concerned about making sure that there wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach, about giving the opportunity for flexible spaces, having non-prescriptive play. On the other side, you had principals who had very pragmatic suggestions, this notion of repeating elements so that you don't have issues of territoriality, the need for slow speed socializing, environments for those students who don't want to play traditional sport, have opportunities to engage with each other and actually undertake physical activity in ways that they could still meander and get some physical exercise during break periods. In terms of issues of passage, it was making clear that there were indoor-outdoor transitions and that they were easy and blended in terms of how students could enter in and out of outdoor spaces. The importance of having hangout zones near active areas so students could kind of duck into active periods of activity and duck out and hang with groups and socialize with their friends. Differences here, again, designers having kind of that broader picture in terms of the outdoor design strategy and making sure that it's coherent and well aligned with what's going on with the building facility itself, and making sure the two of those designs are married together. Principles, high priority, weather protection. Again, very pragmatic and recognizing that, metal benches that are in high areas of sun, they're going to burn people when they try to sit on them, or they won't be as accommodating of students. So again, it's a really nice synthesis of getting both of those perspectives in the designs of these spaces. And then finally, issues of attraction. Where both recognize the importance of storytelling through site features, although it was more on the low priority list. There were quite larger differences between designers and principals in terms of what should be at the top. For designers, it was a recognition around creating smaller spaces for refuge, where you can have those small, intimate social gathering areas. And for principals, it was more about having materials that were fit for purpose and practical. And this goes on, in terms of designers recognizing the desire to have nature immersion, having flora and fauna that really embed that into the experience of the students. Whereas for the principals, again, having visual connectivity across the site was really important, particularly for passive surveillance to make sure that students felt safe. Another study that I undertook then was to look at areas of freedom. So really looking at the existing schoolyard environments and understanding how is that benefiting students as they're existing now. So I actually had a case study within Canberra. We looked at it was a public school that looked at students in years 7 to 10. And we undertook two parts. One was a survey that was circulated to the entire school body. And then the second one was having a series of focus group discussions with students themselves. Up to 40 students were interviewed. Now, in the survey that was circulated, we asked a range of questions. One was a series of questions that the students identified, the areas that were important to them. It was creating areas of personal connection. They wanted to reflect on issues of design adaptability, making sure they had a diversity of functions. It was about issues of likability and access. Then there's a second tool that I use that's within research called the Perceived Restorativeness tool. And it's, again, addressing issues around fascination, being away, compatibility, and extent in terms of how all of those factors are being addressed in the design of the schoolyard and contributing to student well-being. And this is where we got some interesting feedback. So there were patterns that emerged in terms of how female students and older students perceive their outdoor spaces. In the graphs here, you'll actually see that on the x-axis, you have the year levels, 7, 8, 9, and 10. The green solid line indicates female responses. The blue dashed line indicates male student responses. And you'll see over time, female students were more negative than male students in their perceptions of schoolyard accessibility, likability, and personal connection. And this is important to flag because I think it's recognizing that one size fits all approach within our school environments, perhaps there is this bigger need of diversifying the options of activities that we're providing them. A similar trend was also found using that perceived restorativeness tool. Again, especially that issue of being away. Male students seem to be tracking okay. They had these sporting environments that they could engage with, but the female students, they really suffered, especially as they went on in older year levels, in terms of feeling like that space was a space they could engage with. Now, attention to this particular study, it got a bit of media, which was really beneficial because that's part of the project of what we want to do is building up this data, this evidence to help affect change. And I'm happy to share that it was through this study that a review was undertaken within the Legislative Assembly at the ACT and has now been recognized within guidelines of the issue of recognizing there are differences that need to be accounted for in terms of gender and their needs within schoolyard landscapes. And as I mentioned, we also undertook focus group discussions with each year level. And it was, again, quite fascinating in terms of the type of feedback that we were given. And again, trends that started to emerge, both in the differences between what female students and male students wanted. And some of them broke your heart, like the top quote, which one female student told me, "I don't like school in general, but if I went out for a bit, it changes my mood somewhat. So I don't disrespect anyone else, I just disrespect myself." There was this constant trend, again, where the female students, when I asked them where did they go, and it was predominantly on the sidelines, where they like to gather in their groups and socialize and watch the guys play sport. I gave the students exercises where they would take frames out into the schoolyard and actually photograph those areas that they liked using a green frame and areas that they didn't like using a red frame. This mural in particular caused a lot of angst amongst the students because it appeared one day and the students hadn't been consulted. They saw that it was meant to be an educational component about healthy food and healthy eating. But one of the male students who had been quite aggressive during the focus group discussion, was really passionate in saying this was a lost opportunity. It could have been a great idea for the year 10 students to have a mural that they got to decorate each year as a graduating gift to the underclass. So it was just a reminder that role of student voice and its importance in giving students agency and ownership within their schoolyard spaces really needs to be acknowledged. As part of this exercise, I also undertook a series of mapping exercises. I had the students identify where did they go for lunch, where did they go for recess, what were the areas they perceived as active areas, what were the areas they perceived as passive or quiet areas, what areas did they feel unsafe. And then pulling together and synthesizing those maps, I compiled it into one map, and that really identified, based on student feedback, what were the active areas and what were the more passive or quiet areas within this particular school. And then I also mapped out, where did the female students go and where did the male students go? And some of the patterns that we saw emerge aligned with what we saw in some of that survey data. In the top images on the left and the right, this open circles indicate where the females in year 7 would go, and the open triangles indicate where the male students would go. And in year 7, a lot of them tend to go across the extent of the schoolyard site. But then in year 8, it's that time when you have change happening. You've got puberty happening. You've got different stresses happening, perhaps within social groups. But a lot of the female students shrink. They shrink back into the interior spaces of the school in areas like the library and the canteen, where the male students, on the other hand, while they also there is a bit of attrition, they're still engaging with some of those open spaces and those active spaces. Another activity I had them undertake was what I call the rosebud and thorn. So really in green dots, identifying those areas they like to hang out in. Yellow circles are those areas that have potential for positive change, and red areas being those areas that they don't like, that they stay away from. And like I mentioned before, I had the students go out and map these as well through photo documentation, through this framing exercise, identifying what they liked and what they didn't like in the schoolyard. And while I synthesized these results together, it looks like a lot of noise initially. So the top diagram, where you have the solid black circles and the solid black triangles, show you the spaces where female and male students enjoyed being in the schoolyard. In the bottom, you see empty circles with crosses and the empty triangles. And those are areas that the students identified as red areas, areas that they would avoid. And there is an interesting trend whereas the female students predominantly identified those active areas as areas to avoid, whereas the male students, those were some of the places they would go, that they wanted to be in. So there are these elevated differences in terms of how students are engaging with the schoolyard. When I took the feedback from the photo essay, another series of observations was made. What students liked about their schoolyard. For female students, it was about the environment. It was making sure that it was a comfortable space, an inclusive space where they could hang with their friends. For a lot of the male students, majority of them, it was important to have areas of activity, areas of play. When we asked the students, well, what didn't you like about the schoolyard and why? Male students predominantly said, it was boring or it was crowded. But for the female students, predominantly, their comment was they felt unsafe. And this is something which I think needs better addressing within some of our schoolyard spaces. Now, we've taken a look at what the designers and the principals believe should be a matter of fit for schoolyard spaces. We've taken a look at the freedom of existing schoolyard spaces and what that enables for students. The last study I undertook was actually trying to understand the need. What would students want if they could have the ideal schoolyard space? What do they want that will enable them to function best during the school day? And so I did this by undertaking a design competition in Canberra for students in years 7 to 12. And it was a lot of fun. We had students require them to submit an A3 poster and a one-page summary of their ideal schoolyard space. So we had 38 students submit entries. And some of them were quite colorful. Many of them there were certain themes that carried through each of them. One was the importance of beauty. So real attention to issues such as color, particularly blue, that was seen as a calming space. The notion that there is a cue to care, a cue to maintenance of these spaces. And so that embeds a certain value. The sight of nature was really important in terms of having a calming effect. There was also a theme, again, of around agency. This was a particular park created by students, which you can't quite tell in the dimensions, but I think it's about 100 meters tall and had a moat that was about 50 meters wide, and you could only access this structure by using a canoe. So there was this sense that, you wanted to push against the rules. You wanted to have opportunities to play and be spontaneous and have a bit of non-prescriptive, in terms of what they could do within the schoolyard space. It also addresses issues of scale, that notion of feeling small that we enjoy when we're young, especially in primary school levels. It's still desired within those older levels as well, that sense of awe and adventure. There was ideas around adaptability, so creating comfortable spaces that could be used by a large cohort of students. It was seen as promoting community and life pods. In this submission, it was actually about creating cozy internal lounge spaces inside these pods, and on the exterior could actually be very active areas. So you could have slides, you could have climbing walls and stepping stones on top. And finally, it was about connection. So this particular entry was by a student who actually went on crutches for a period of time and found that her courtyard space in her school wasn't accessible by wheelchair easily. And so she wanted to fix that in a fun way. And so it was about putting in ramps. It was about putting in slides, and not just one slide, but 2 slides, because that way you could create a game in terms of with your friends. It was about building school spirit. She commented that a lot of the coloring within schoolyards was gray and felt bland and quite lifeless. And she really thought that embedding some of the logos of the school emblem into the landscape would help make it a greater sense of ownership by students. And so that's correlates with some of what the designers and principals were thinking, right? Issues of beauty, agency, adaptability, and social connection. And there was also a desire for less traditional sporty spaces. The idea of independent fitness stations, so rather than relying on team sport, having opportunities to break away, do a bit of weightlifting, independent fitness was important. Amidst all of the submissions, aesthetics, beauty, that rose to the surface of a lot of the kinds of discussions and ideas that were being generated by students. And interestingly, a lot of the female students predominantly talked about learning spaces, outdoor learning spaces, and places where they could socialize and talk with their friends. So I'll leave you with this. What if schoolyards could be empowered to help girls to be active, could prevent bullying, could enable kids with disabilities? There's so many opportunities in terms of how we can better program these spaces as a preventative tool that can really support and promote positive outdoor experiences for our kids. And I'll leave on this note, excitingly, the research that we undertook from the last 3 years has now been put into a grant that will continue for 2 more years. And so a lot of the research that we undertook at the local level within Canberra, we're now going to be piloting and taking it nationally. So if this is something which you are interested to be engaged with, to contribute to that body of research and understanding how we can build schoolyard environments that contribute to the health and well-being of our students, we would love to talk to you and incorporate you as part of this space. So thank you. And I'll stop sharing from here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all that, Gweneth. It was an amazing presentation of lots of different ideas for us to get our heads around. Happy if people have questions to post them in the comments section or in the chat section, and we can share them and go through them. I guess starting off, one of the things I guess you've really pointed out is the importance of landscape and the use of the spaces. With your research, how have you gone with the old adage that essentially landscaping is the last thing and gets value managed within an inch of its life in projects, when your research shows it's perhaps one of the most important elements of a project that we really need to be putting a far greater focus on for students?
No. You bring up a really good point, Eric. I mean, this is actually why I started going into the research as a landscape architect, because we were often the first thing off the budgets when things got cut. And so part of this research is trying to build that evidence. And it's been fascinating to me to see the traction and how it resonates with a lot of people. I've had parents reaching out to me. We're reaching out to different advocacy groups because the experiences that happen in the schoolyard space are quite formative. We all, I think, can reflect back on what our own schoolyard experiences were like, positive and negative and otherwise. But it's been about documenting this and interpreting this into a data form so that we can turn it around and demonstrate and illustrate to those who are creating the budgets to say, listen, this is shown to have impact. This is shown to be a desirable component that we need to invest more in. So it's building up that repertoire, I think, of knowledge.
Yep. There's one comment. Can you just post your email address, please, Gweneth, when you get a chance into the comments again? Taking that further then, so the research project in Canberra looks amazing with the students, and obviously the students themselves are actually highly engaged in it to get 40 students per class group actually engaged. Has that been able to be transferred into real projects and changes in that school? Has that opportunity occurred?
We were in a very fortunate position where this particular school had been selected as a potential recipient of funding from the government. And so there was a real desire to engage with the students from the get-go. And there was the opportunity to do that. And so the results from this particular exercise did help inform and validate the need for updating that schoolyard space, which they did end up including. I think that it got slight delayed by funding, but they ended up including a ninja activity space. So it incorporated those notions of sitting areas close to some of these activity areas and a less traditional sporting equipment, so they could have a little bit of a track and a bit of parkour to enjoy these spaces.
Yeah. And in reflection, have you been able to go back and sort of do the study again to see the impact on the students now as a comparison?
I want to. So it's on the list. It's the challenge of time and the challenge of ethics. So yeah.
It'd be amazing to see that flow through. Everyone else seems very quiet. So obviously you've amazed them with all the amazing information there. If no one else has any questions at this point in time, then we might draw it to a close and thank everyone for their... Firstly, thank you, Gweneth, for all your time today. It was amazing, and I feel like there's a whole range of other conversations to be had with different people. So it's been an amazing body of research to get to where you are, and we look forward to seeing where that develops with the other projects coming through. So we appreciate that, and I don't know, look forward to how that might go. Oh, now they're flying in. So here, so we've got one here from Dr. Fiona Young. In New South Wales, where there is a template for public school building design, it's obvious how important landscape is. Have you had an opportunity to share your research with Schools Infrastructure New South Wales or other school systems yet?
Yeah, we're in the process of that right now. So, and reaching out and re-engaging. Now that we've got this more national focus, it's starting to have some of those, initiate some of those conversations.
On that note, we'll say thank you very much for everyone who's attended. Hopefully you all got as much out of it as we did. And again, finally, a big thank you to Dr. Gweneth Leigh for her time this afternoon to put it all together and provide these ideas. So thank you very much.
Thank you.